Hello, everybody. I hope you can hear this okay. Right, I'm going to begin by talking about the personalities of historic church buildings and the need to adapt them to suit the 21st century. After which I'll briefly touch upon my experience of doing so in the United Kingdom. Then I'll go on to describe 3 case studies of churches in England whose essential personalities have been adapted in sensitive and modest ways to make them more welcoming and more friendly, allowing them to work better for the congregations and the local communities they serve. Finally, I'll conclude by summing up the lessons that I think these case studies teach us. So, if your church was a person, what would it be like? A slick professional, perhaps? An energetic adolescent? A grumpy old man? Is your church a he or a she? In other words, what is the personality of your church building? Do you look forward to spending time with it? What is it saying, and do you imagine that others who have yet to visit would want to get to know it? Victorian times saw a massive resurgence in the repair and conservation of historic church buildings in the UK and the construction of thousands of new churches both in the UK and in throughout the British colonies. And obviously, many of you will recognise this book as a book that was brought out to commemorate 150 years of churches in South Australia. Obviously, in 1986, this book was published. Churches built in Victorian times in Britain and in South Australia were designed to suit the constrained and conservative pattern of worship of the 19th century. The majority of these designs don't lend themselves well to the needs of 21st century worship and community engagement. An average Victorian church, if an average Victorian church was a person, it would most likely be prudish and straight-laced, not someone you would feel comfortable spending time with today, and certainly not if you were a non-practicing Christian being encouraged to enter a church for a community event. Before coming to South Australia, I worked as a heritage architect in Scotland, specialising in historic churches. Many of the churches I worked to modernise had diminishing numbers of worshippers and ageing fabric. I oversaw repairs and design adaptations that re-energised them, giving them a new lease of life that helped them once again speak confidently to their congregations and their local communities. So, 2 examples. I'm not going to spend a lot of time because many of you will have seen me talking about these in previous conferences. But 2 examples of these churches are. This first one is St. Paul the Apostle, which is a church in the East End of Glasgow. And in this particular instance, we were advised by the church itself that they felt there was no connection with the street. There was no sense of dynamism, even when the car park was absolutely full. So we effectively were asked to build a shop window. So we were able to disguise this rather unattractive community hall at the back, and we built a new space at the front of the building. And this was part of the space that we built. So it really did enliven, it really did speak to the street and made the building feel like it was part of the community because you could see everything that was happening inside. The second building that we worked on was St. Andrew's. This is one of many, of course, but this is the second one I'll speak about. St. Andrew's East Church, again in the East End of Glasgow. Formerly a beautiful little gem of a church. The congregation grew so quickly. It was built in 1899. The congregation grew extremely quickly. It wasn't big enough. They built a much bigger church. And this church became a church hall for 70 or 80 years. In fact, longer than that. Yeah, 70 or 80 years, in fact. Then they sold. Then the congregation dwindled away, and they didn't have many worshippers left. And they decided they could easily fit into this space, and they sold the larger church. So we were asked to come in and regenerate this little building, and it was a beautiful little project. And in fact, what we built contains a vestry, kitchen, toilets, and storage, just in this little space at the back of the place of worship. And because all the pews had formerly been stripped out of this space, it's actually when we put loose seating in, it's a very, very flexible, beautiful space. I even designed the furniture on the chancel, and it folds up and tucks into the stores to either side. So it's an eminently flexible space. And we were able to open up this wonderful roof structure. So when I worked in the UK, I responded to the specific challenges faced by individual congregations. It was only after coming to Australia that I realized just how many congregations throughout the world are actually facing problems of trying to maintain and repair their historic buildings. I became aware of a major worldwide movement towards a stronger engagement between churches and their local communities. So, obviously, the Canadian talk that Darren gave touches on places for Partners for Sacred Places based in Philadelphia in the United States. And this organization has been going since the 1980s. And obviously, we also touched upon the webinar that took place in Canada last year, spookily called Regenerating Places of Faith. So I think we borrowed that title. So, and in the UK, of course, I'll go on to talk about the UK, but in the UK, it's especially reflected through recent policy changes within the Church of England, the National Churches Trust, and Historic England. So, how can the personalities of our historic churches in South Australia be altered to suit the 21st century, the lifestyles in the 21st century, and to offer engagement with their local communities without diminishing the gravitas that these churches have as sacred places? I've chosen 3 case studies from England that demonstrate sensitive and yet modest adaptations that have made these historic churches brighter, livelier, and more extrovert places. Anyone would now feel comfortable in visiting them, whether a practicing Christian or not. But at the same time, they have lost none of their importance as sacred places of worship. And all of these case studies, I'm sorry, I seem to be losing the top and bottom of the slide, but anyway, all of these case studies have been taken from an excellent book by Becky Payne called Churches for Communities. And it's really looking at adapting Oxfordshire's churches for wider use. So it's talking about churches in rural areas, but they're talking about communities, and we have communities obviously within cities as well. So this is the very first case study. This is St. Agatha's. And St. Agatha's is a highly significant heritage-listed rural parish church with foundations dating back to the 12th century. So we're talking some very old churches here. And in 2004, the local parish was one of the first in England to publish a community plan, a community-led parish plan, should I say, setting out a vision for how the parish should evolve over the decade to follow. So the issues. One of the main priorities that came out in the plan was to create a new community focus at the church. So coffee mornings were established that helped to develop the church's role in the community. And there was a proposal to install toilets to enable the building to be used for more community activities. This church had actually been running for 850 years without a toilet. It's quite extraordinary. So to have a toilet after 850 years is quite a big deal. So in terms of the purposes of the project, to quote the client, the community had been looking at ways to foster greater integration of church and community, leading to improved facilities and utilization of the church. The feeling was that the church was an historic building for everyone in the community, and that if there was going to be fundraising, that it had to involve the whole community and not just church people. So what steps were taken? In 2009, the local church council did its own survey to make sure that the project had the backing of the community. Questionnaires were hand-delivered by the project team to everyone in the village, and the team returned in person to collect them to ensure that there would be a good response. Proposals to put facilities inside the church were not considered feasible, as the seating space needed, the seating space was required within the church due to the size of the community itself, and because reordering the church was likely to cause a lot of divisions within the community. Originally, the church council had considered building just a porch with toilets, but even a small addition was going to cost the equivalent of $100,000 to $120,000. It was therefore considered more cost-effective to construct a larger building that could include a kitchenette and a meeting room. Now, although a freestanding building was originally suggested, the church council members decided they wanted a church room as part of the actual church building itself. And rather than creating a new opening into a very important historic church, a historic building, they utilized the 12th century doorway, the southern doorway, to link the new church room into the original worship space. So just faintly here you can see the 12th century door leading directly into the worship space. The total project cost was $350,000, a third of which came from the village. The project team stated, "We could not have established in advance the amount of commitment required by the community and the church to work together." Sorry, I should have just touched on that briefly. What we obviously see here is a toilet, then an accessible toilet. We have a multifunctional space and a little kitchenette. So what was achieved? The church council was very pleased with the new church. They have been very pleased with the new church room, and it holds all its meetings there because it's much more economical than heating the entire church to hold meetings in. The new space is heavily booked throughout the week by small community groups, and reading and drama events benefit from using the extension rather than having to hire a marquee, which they did formerly. Sunday school, formerly held in the village hall, now meets in the church room adjacent to the worship space. So challenges. One of the big challenges for the church was keeping costs down, especially because of the high level of financial responsibility in working with money that was provided by the local community. The church council had a well-coordinated local fundraising campaign, and each committee member focused on the area near where they lived and wrote individually to those they knew. There were also many fundraising community events. One of the lessons learned by the church council was to separate the responsibility for detailed project management from the responsibility for fundraising, as people needed to focus on their own areas. At the same time, communications between the project managers and the fundraisers needed to be regular and open. So, lessons learned. The best piece of advice the church council could offer was that running a project like this is a long haul. So you must have a good team with plenty of stamina. Also, having a business plan is essential to ensure that all aspects of your project are thought through. So the second case study. This shows that it's possible to make sensitive yet relatively bold additions inside a highly significant church building that can greatly improve its flexibility in accommodating a wide variety of community uses. So this is the Church of St. John the Baptist, and it's in a village of around about 800 people. The original church dates back to the 12th century, And the present Church of St. John, which is highly significant historically, obviously, was built in 1588. So the church itself was isolated within the village. It was damp, it was cold, it had no mains water or drainage, and it stood empty for 6 days of the week. The other resource available to the community was the primary school hall, but it was impossible to use during school hours. The village hadn't had a community hall since the 1960s and set about creating one within the church to provide residents with an aesthetically pleasing, practical, and accessible place to meet. Now, during extensive consultation in the village, the question was therefore not, do we need to build a village hall? But rather, do we have the resources in the village that we could be using more effectively? So they had the resources of the primary school and they had the resources of the church. They needed to find ways of getting them to work together. And so I think this demonstrates the depth into which they went in submitting questionnaires to the local residents and the kind of information that came out of that, and a really extensive consultation. So altogether, 25% of the population of the village responded to a questionnaire. Pretty good response, I think. And 89% of them supported the development of another type of community meeting space to supplement the limited uses offered by the school. So the vast majority of people could see the benefit. The results were presented to an open meeting of villagers, and it was agreed that the village's main two resources, the school and the church, should be reviewed to find better ways of using them both. So the purposes of the project. So from these graphs, from the information that was gleaned from the questionnaire, the following activities were identified as being needed in the village. So during the day, the villagers liked the idea of having exercise classes, coffee mornings, a lunch club for older people, and a mother and toddler group. And during the evening, film club, concerts, youth club, social events, and special interest groups. The drivers for change, well, the village had an aging population, and there were no facilities suitable for regular use by groups supporting older people within the village. A growing number of children in the village, well, while there were facilities for smaller children, there were no facilities for the older kids. Cost and inconvenience of travel, well, because of the cost of fuel and the inconvenience of travel, fewer people were willing to drive out of the village for social activities. And diminishing numbers of worshippers. Funding church activities, including the maintenance and repair of the church building itself, was becoming increasingly more difficult. So there were some significant changes to the church, and these were as follows. The Victorian pews were all taken away, and new, modern, flexible, movable seating was purchased, which could be stored away and allow the space to be used for a variety of functions when worship wasn't taking place. A kitchen was installed. This is a bit of a surprise. They installed the kitchen inside the main worship space. So the kitchen was installed in the west end of the north aisle. So this is actually a kitchen here, open to the worship space. And a small extension was built on the south side of the tower to contain toilets. So this is the extension containing toilets. And they've also moved the font from the rear of the church to the front of the church, which it's much more accessible, much more convenient. The opportunity was taken to put in new lighting, both inside the church and outside the church, and the nave and aisle roof were insulated and redecorated. So the church had a big overhaul at the time. So what was achieved? Well, by upgrading the church for community activities, some of the benefits were that improvements were made to the heating, that amenities were provided for visitors attending weddings and funerals, as well as for worshippers. Accessibility into the church was improved. The church has been able to extend its activities in serving the community, such as by establishing a lunch club for older people. More people have been attracted into the church for community events, who then often return for worship. And the fabric of the existing church has been preserved. The estimated cost of this project was around $750,000, or the equivalent. There were many fundraising events organised, and the Victorian pews were auctioned off. Grants were awarded by various organisations, including South Oxfordshire District Council, whose grant of $200,000, or the equivalent of course, required a clawback clause stating that if the church no longer used the building for community events, then the council may seek the money that they'd given them back. Since its completion, the church has been heavily booked. The church room, rather, has been heavily booked for activities every day. And the church itself has been used for Pilates classes, parties by a range of clubs, and by a mother and toddlers group. The church council is getting used to different ways of using the building, ensuring that the balance is correct between community uses and its needs, its use for as a continuing place for worship. Originally, there was obviously some concern expressed about being able to maintain the religious feel of a building that was also going to be used for social activities, for community activities. And the response at the time to this question was that many churches had already successfully achieved this blend of community use and as a place of worship, and that respecting the religious space would underpin the future proposals. And I think it appears, certainly to me, that it appears that they've achieved this well in this particular instance in St. John's. So the biggest challenge, apparently, was the decision to consult fully on all aspects of the project throughout its duration, which, although a major undertaking, ensured that concerns could be raised, discussed, and resolved efficiently, effectively, and without dispute. The lessons learned. The main lesson learned was that when fundraising, to concentrate on organising productive activities. Don't exhaust your team by running too many events for small returns. An important advice is to provide a clear and concise project brief to enable consultants and builders to undertake the work and deliver the final project on time and on budget. Right, the last case study is St. Thomas of Canterbury. Now, serving a large village of a population of around 3,500 on the Thames in South Oxfordshire, St. Thomas is a Grade 1 listed church and has retained its overall 11th century Romanesque style. The church has long been the focus of community activities, holding regular events, concerts, and meetings. So the issues are that in the 1990s, the church was acknowledged as dark, gloomy, and damp. The church council wanted to create a warmer and more welcoming space, and the goal was to improve accessibility and provide new facilities and flexible spaces for multiple uses in order to reinforce the connections and better serve the wider community. The project was begun to address the functional shortcomings of the church and its inability to act as a genuine community resource. The project aimed to allow the building to be more flexible, accommodate different activities, and bring the church and community closer. It also had to deal with essential repairs and try and make the building cheaper to run and more comfortable thermally. So what was achieved? There was a major reordering or reorganization of the church, and amongst other things, the following works were carried out. So they built a major extension down one side of the church, and this contains a long room that's subdivided by a number of wooden partitions. It also contains a servery, a kitchen, and some toilets. The existing floor within the church was lifted, and they put in underfloor heating system throughout both the church and the extension. The church was redecorated and new services were installed, including lighting and a sound system. And the church pews once again were stripped out and replaced with purpose-made stackable chairs and pews. So we're stacking it up in terms of costs here. So obviously this is of a different scale. The works were completed in September 2009, and the total cost was $1.8 million, or the equivalent, $1.8 million. But there's been great feedback from the congregation and from locals, and the Church of England, who use this as an exemplar project. One member of the church congregation stated that one of the surprising byproducts of the reordering of the church had been that, as a church, we are now much more informal and relaxed. So historic England has the view, or takes the view, that churches have always developed and grown. So change is nothing new. And of course, the planning and heritage authorities are particularly keen to see a sensitive approach in the junction between the old and new, as always. And as such, if I just jump to the next slide, and this is this long room that I referred to with these the partitions that subdivide it. And the junction between old and new is this linear glazed roof light that runs the full length. So you always get a sense of being in the new space and where the original place of worship is. And this much more open church where they can put their loose seating during times of worship can be used for lots of other functions, and it's been, I should have had a before and after, but this is a much improved, much brighter, much more friendly space now that they've done the redecoration works. So interestingly, the architects told me that the church work in the UK at the moment, that as a whole with church work at the moment, the whole process of permission hangs on whether there's a proven need for change. And if there is, does this need outweigh any potential harm to the existing historic fabric of the building? So you can obviously appreciate this is an incredibly valuable historic building dating back as far as it does. They've made some fairly radical changes to this building, but they'd obviously perceived in making decisions about it that for its own survival that it justified those changes. So the architects told me that the majority of sorry, I'm repeating myself now. So the challenges, obviously the cost of the works was a huge challenge. We're talking about much larger sums of money than the very first case study. But the church's minister said that it had been humbling to receive money from local people who had no connection with the church, but for whom the building was important. I don't think we can forget that within our communities that people who don't necessarily go to the church may well consider it an important asset within their communities. So, lessons learned. Beware of increasing costs due, for example, to increases in the scope of works and rising costs in the construction industry. But also make use of free local newspapers, if you can, in which you can explain proposals and give updates on progress to keep everyone informed. So keeping people informed of what's happening is incredibly important, as you all know. And the best piece of advice, expect and accept that you will face opposition. You need to be resolute while continually trying to articulate your vision, consult, and listen to feedback. So I think what all these case studies have in common is that regeneration works have transformed the personalities of what have been cold, damp, dingy, and generally unfriendly churches and given them new personalities that are warm and welcoming. A sense of social inclusion that not only has encouraged many to visit who might not otherwise have stepped across the thresholds, but has also seen the fabric of these churches repaired so as to enable them to carry out their mission perhaps for another 800 or 900 years as they've been doing up to now. What I take from these examples is as follows. Consult and communicate extensively throughout all stages of a project with both your congregation and with the local community to determine their future needs and aspirations and to answer their concerns. Be clear and concise about the goals that arise from consultation and write a detailed brief and scope of works. Compile a business plan that provides direction in achieving the goals. Have an energetic and capable project team with roles clearly defined between fundraisers and project managers, whilst making sure that both communicate with each other regularly. Keep control of rising costs, and finally, work closely with statutory authorities to ensure that your proposals comply. Now, I'm going to be mildly controversial here. I would put it to you that in 2017, Adelaide is a city of tired churches. I felt I needed to put that on in case anybody didn't notice the tired, by the way. Diminishing numbers of worshippers combined with an unwillingness by state government to fund heritage and a shortage of skills in traditional trades have left many of South Australia's churches in perilous condition. If we don't take serious action now, many more of Adelaide's beloved churches will be lost. We are all custodians of South Australia's church heritage, built by our forebears with passion and with great vision. Let us work together to make sure that by the 200-year commemoration of churches in South Australia, that our places of worship relate better to the local communities and are physically fit to serve their mission for another 200 years. I'm going to try and finish on a slightly lighter note. I think we think sometimes we're getting inclement weather in South Australia. I was somewhat taken by this photograph, particularly by the challenge of the rainwater goods here to cope with the volume of water here. But this is obviously a church in Cornwall that's got caught in the storms in the last couple of weeks. And it's a fairly dramatic shot. So, thank you for listening.